Hi, I'm Matthew Touch, editor of Rediscovering Frank Yerby, critical essays, which just came out with the University Press of Mississippi. And today I'm talking with Dr. Veronica Watson, who has an essay in this collection, but who also has a book, The Short Stories of Frank Yerby, which is out from the University Press of Mississippi as well. She's the author of The Souls of White Folks, African-American Writers Theorize Whiteness, and she has a chapter in there about Yerbys, Foxes of Harrow. That's also University Press of Mississippi. And today we're going to talk about Yerby's short stories and his life and kind of who he was. So welcome, Dr. Watson.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
It's great to have you. You know, I love reading your essay in here in the book, but also, of course, you bringing his short stories back because your collection has how many stories in it?
It has 15 stories in it, 11 of which have not been previously published.
Right, and you're the one who actually showed me "Salute to the Flag" from Payne's student paper, which is an amazing story we can talk about later too. But here's the question I kind of want to start with, which I start with everybody. How did you come across Frank Yerby? What got you interested in him?
Yeah, so a great story. When I was researching Souls of White Folks, I was in several archives. I was traveling to find out as much as I could for the book. That's actually how I found Frank in the first place. Someone had given me The Foxes of Harrow as an end of semester read. They're like, it's going to be a lot of fun. It's lighthearted. You'll enjoy it. And lo and behold, I got really interested in what was going on in that book. And so that became kind of the genesis of the book. And so as I was researching Souls, I went to the archive at Boston University, and I was in there just sort of looking at, there are probably about 25 boxes of material in there. And one box had a lot of short stories. And so that's how I found those stories in the first place. I didn't read them at the time, but I kind of knew that they were sitting there. So once I finished Souls and kind of went back and started thinking about what my next project was, I knew it had to be about Frank because there was just so little out there on him. And there was so little scholarly and intellectual rich attention to him. So I wanted to really kind of focus on trying to get something of his back in the publication. So that's how I kind of settled on the short stories when it came down to it, because I felt like those would be easier to work with and faster in terms of getting them out to the public.
Yeah, and I think the short stories really show a different side of Frank. I mean, one thing that strikes me with your essay, and actually a couple of essays in the collection, Catherine Adams as well, she taught at Payne, but you actually interviewed people who knew Frank or who knew the family in Augusta. You talk about interviewing James Carter and Mallory Melender in Augusta. Can you tell us about interviewing them and what kind of stories and humanizing aspects they gave to Frank?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Catherine was very helpful in getting that whole process set up. So when I traveled to Augusta, I was really trying to get a sense of the community that shaped him as a young man and as a young artist, right? And to get a sense of what he grew out of in terms of who shaped him, what would have been his norms in terms of how he grew up and the kinds of things that he really talked about leaving the South to get away from. So, we all sort of know that historically, but I wanted to be in the community where he was born and raised. So these two interviews I had were set up by folks there at Payne College, and shout out to Payne and to all of those who helped me with that work. They were just a really wonderfully loving and embracing community. And for anyone who's really looking to try to understand Frank Yerby and bring him back, that's your home. So they were great. So when I talked to James Carter, who's the local historian of Black history in Augusta, he actually knew the Yerby family. And his mother taught Frank and probably some of the other kids. And so James was able to tell me about a story that I had actually read, an interview where Frank talked about it. He said that he and his sister were walking along the streets of Augusta, and they were pulled over by cops because his sister was very, very fair. And, he was a light-skinned man, if you will, but his sister was very fair. And they thought that there was some sort of crossing of the social mores there happening, and a Black man was walking with a white woman. And so they pulled him over, and he said that, they kind of shook him up and, gave them a stern warning. Oh, that's your sister. Okay, get on out of here, kind of thing. Well, when I talked to James Carter, he actually recalled that Frank had been hospitalized as a result of that encounter, and that there had been some physical abuse happening there. And so, that was one of those things where I could kind of understand either memories are just different of the incident, or, that might have been something that Frank didn't necessarily want to share in terms of a public persona that was out in the world at a particular time. Maybe it was too painful for him to really kind of reflect on. So, it was those kinds of moments where I was able to kind of start to see him as a full human being, right? Not just this guy whose work I have been reading now for several years. When I spoke to Mallory Melinder, he's a former faculty member at Payne College. And Mallory said something really interesting, which was that he believed that Frank really tried to show Black life in all of his work. And that was really interesting to me, because that's not what Frank is known for, right? Frank is known kind of as this white life author, this author who wrote loosely about white characters. And so to hear someone from that community really validate him in that particular way, I thought was interesting. And, sort of shows the connection that they still feel to him, and the ways in which they were able to see that even if his primary characters weren't always African American or of African descent, that the characters who were there were still serving a very particular political and social purpose. And so I just really loved that they were able to recognize that when, scholars didn't necessarily see that.
And you say, this is Mallory's quote, Yerby had a mission to interpret the world, particularly the world as it affected Black people, as you said. And I see that in his work.
Yes.
Like you said, even though his novels, except for two, are literature of white estrangement or focus on white characters, he has these moments, and he humanizes his Black characters in ways that other authors aren't, especially white authors, of course, what I'm talking about here, don't.
Right.
Thinking of Faulkner and others as well. I mean, you can look at Foxes and look at the Black characters compared to the white characters and who's the more virtuous.
You're right.
That's the same in Benton's Row and most of his other novels too. Even things that are set in different time periods, like the Saracen Blade in medieval Italy, he's dealing with issues that I would say affect Black Americans. He's dealing with that in Goat Song, which is 1967 and set in Sparta. There's passages in there that read like they could be taken out of there and put into Speak Now.
Right, absolutely.
With interracial relationships, with other kind of things. The main character talks about his mother being Spartan and his dad being Helot, and his dad's a slave, basically. But he says something about, if in this case I'm mixed. He doesn't use the term mulatto, but that's basically the phrase he's using. But if it was the other way around, it'd be a bastard. So these types of kind of discussions, and that incident. What were you going to say? Sorry.
No, you were fine. I was just going to comment that Frank himself said in a couple of interviews that he really understood himself as doing that work, right? Of surfacing the issues that face Black Americans in every novel that he wrote. And he also said that he was really committed to showing a fuller picture of Black life. And so I think you're absolutely right that it doesn't matter what the setting, what the context, what the historical period that it's placed in, he was doing that work.
And he's showing it. I don't remember who said it, but you said somebody said that he was a citizen of the world. So he's not just showing American Black life too. He's showing the diaspora.
Yes.
If you think about it, especially if you think about some of the historical novels and the ways that he connects Africa to the rise of civilization. The Dahomean definitely does that.
And of course, he was a well-traveled man. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
I was gonna say even novels not like the Dahomean, the Saracen Blade.
I was just saying he was a well-traveled man.
Yeah. I know I showed this earlier, but of course I found the newspapers about him traveling to Haiti to research the Golden Hawk.
Mhm. Yes. In the archives, there are letters that he wrote to various people all over the world doing historical research. So, for instance, there's a letter that he wrote to a monastery. I want to say it was, oh no, I'm not going to remember that. I don't remember the location, but he did write it to a monastery asking about medieval names because he wanted to make sure that that was accurate in the novel that he was writing. And so, absolutely, not only is he not well traveled himself and a citizen of the world, but he is an absolutely meticulous researcher. And
Yeah.
so that sort of level of commitment to the truth and to a historical accuracy, I think is one of the things that really means that he should have more attention because he's doing some incredible work there.
And that meticulous research comes through not in every book, but in a lot with the footnotes and the endnotes. It's almost like reading an academic book with some of the endnotes that he has, especially in something, again, like the Saracen.
That is. Right.
Judas,
Right.
my brother, I think, has the same thing. These meticulous footnotes about Hebrew names, I think, in that book. So let's get into your collection because I'm very excited that the short stories are finally getting kind of, some attention, and especially some of the unpublished short stories. So first and foremost, got to ask, what's your favorite short story?
Right. Yeah. That's a really good question because they are all so different. But I must say that I think I'm kind of leaning toward the Schoolhouse of Compere Antoine because it feels alive to me. I feel when I'm reading that short story, I feel like I am running along in the Louisiana, New Orleans township there, and I'm watching these historical events unfold. And so it really feels alive. And that character is so interesting to me because he's not your typical Yerby character. He is older. He has grown sons who are off trying to live their life, and he's being the strong, stalwart dad that he can be in that period of time with so much change happening. He's watching history unfold in front of him, and we're seeing that story through his eyes. And he
that's set
finds
in
an
Reconstruction.
incredible courage to do something late in life to make a difference in his community. It is. It is. So just as the New Orleans is being liberated, and then the period of time after that. So I think I love Compere.
It's been a little while since I read that, but now that I'm starting to think about it, because of course the Vixens deals with Reconstruction, his second novel, and he wanted that to deal a whole lot more with Reconstruction than it did, as Stephanie Brown points out. The manuscript got scrapped by the publisher and it went a different direction. So I'm wondering if that's part of his work there with redefining or resituating Reconstruction and talking about that, following Du Bois and others too. Do you have any idea when that was written, when that story was written?
No, the interesting thing about the short stories is that, at least for the unpublished ones, it is virtually impossible at this point for us to tell when they were written because in the archive, they're simply all in these nice little folders. I think he was working on a short story collection, and so all of them were probably written around the same time, but there are no dates on them. And so there's no way to know when that was composed, between which novels, or maybe it was early on and he just kind of pulled it out and brushed it up. So unfortunately, I don't have that information. So if anybody out there knows anything, please get in touch with us.
But what's really fascinating about that fact too is that if these were done as his career was going, as he was moving throughout his career, the 33 novels that he wrote, then along with the manuscripts that Stephanie Brown has talked about, it totally debunks the myth that he wasn't interested in Black life or social protest.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the ones that were published early in his career, in fact, while he was still in college and doing some graduate work before his first novel, just about all of those are of the sort that we would say or sort of racial protest, right, or social realism. And so he was dismissed for the body of work that he created as a novelist, because people thought that he wasn't engaged in sort of the questions of social equity and social justice that were raging during most of his lifetime. But in fact, he started his career in that venue. And I think that he changed course because he felt that he wasn't going to be able to make a living as a writer if he was pigeonholed in that particular way. So he wanted to do something that would have a wider audience and be able to be sold, so that he could support himself. He wanted to support himself as a writer. And so
Yeah.
that's, I think there's a boldness there that led him in a different direction, but he was absolutely in the conversation. I just don't think people at the time really saw it, because they kind of wrote him off as a fluff artist, right?
Right.
Someone who had a lot of talent, but it wasn't using it for good purposes. And I think they missed the mark on that.
But you have the other thing too, which is, I think it's in the James Hill interview, of course, where he talks about Baldwin. And he's not the only author who does that, but he mentions that Baldwin's preaching to the choir, and the rest of that quote, which I love and I always go back to when people have heard me say it again and again, is that I write for the bigots and the haters and all that. And I got to some of them. So he sees himself, like you said, as writing for a larger audience and hopefully trying to invoke change in that audience.
Yeah, it's a larger white audience, right?
Right.
It's a very particular kind of audience.
Right.
The bigots and the haters, right? He's trying to get them to see something that they wouldn't otherwise see if they knew that that conversation was going to be about, hey, why don't you rethink what you're thinking, right? So,
and that's the discussion we need to have, is how does he? I don't think we can answer the question as if he achieved it, but we need to say, how does he do that? And that is, of course, what Donald M. Washington's piece talks about is his readers, because it's one thing to look at the reviews and the press, but it's another thing to look at actually the reader responses, which I haven't looked at any reader response letters to him or whatever. I've heard there's some in the archives. I'm not sure, but you would know before I would. But yeah, those types of discussions, I think are important about how he did that and if he did it, and how he can still do it today.
Right. I mean, I think he's certainly in a cadre of writers who were grappling with the same issue. So Charles Chesnutt was sort of having the same kinds of questions and issues with his writing. And so I'm trying to exactly. I'm trying to reach people who don't want to be involved in the conversation about social justice. And how do I turn them through my literature, or at least get them to see perspectives and hear perspectives that they would not have otherwise have been exposed to, right? And so I think that for Frank, that was about what we would talk about, is that subtle infusion of these powerful Black characters who were moral and upstanding, and they were, sort of the pillars of their community and had great influence in the societies in which they operated, even though they were socially very limited in terms of what they could do and who they had access to. But they still had this power to them because he was trying to show something about Black life that was not part of the sort of national dominant conversation about what Black life was, right? Yeah. And so in those kinds of ways, I think his effort was to create a book that would be appealing to readers who wouldn't pick up the book that was about social justice, and to have something in there that might make them pause. And so, whether that worked or not, I don't know that we will ever know, but I think that was his strategy. And he wasn't alone with that. He wasn't alone in that.
And they were page turners, like you said. Right. I mean, I can read them, and they're thick, and I can read them, and they're Pulp Fiction.
Yeah, they absolutely are.
Which is exactly what they are. But you mentioned too, one thing I found interesting too, I don't remember where he said this, but he talks about writing short stories, or somebody asked about writing short stories. He's like, it's hard to condense what I've written for 500 pages into 2 to 3.
Yeah, so short stories are harder.
Right. And most of these short stories are short. They're not. We Salute to the Flag's not that long. White Magnolias isn't that long. Some of them in the collection I know are a little bit longer, but most of them are very short stories. And I'd probably say Salute to the Flag is one of the ones. That and White Magnolias are my two favorite. But Salute to the Flag is the dramatic.
I could have two favorites.
What?
You didn't say I could have two favorites. You have two favorites. You made me choose one.
If I had to choose one between those two, right now
I
it's
see
salute to
this
the
is harder to.
right now it's salute to the flag, but
Okay.
because of the fact that it reminds me of the incident of him in Augusta with his sister.
Hmm.
Um, it's a very pointed critique of patriotism and American patriotism, which he gets at in other works too. The Treasure of Pleasant Valley, he kind of has these comments, but it's a dramatic monologue that he wrote. He was at Payne for his BA, right?
Yes.
So while he was getting his undergrad, a dramatic monologue of a soldier who fought during World War One, who came back and is stabbed for not saluting the flag, basically, and he's bleeding out, talking to the doctor, and relates the story of him being in France, winning, of course, the cross there, and his friend winning it too, but his friend being attacked for walking down the street with a white French woman by white Georgians who said they shouldn't do it.
Yeah.
And then, of course, at the end, he dies out by thumbing his nose at the flag too. If he does that, the doctor says he'll die out, and he bleeds out. And
Yep.
basically thumbs his nose at the flag. So this whole question of patriotism, and you asked this question in your piece in Rediscovering Frank Yerby, what exactly are we fighting for? And
Yeah.
he asked that question a lot through his work. And do you want to talk about that briefly? Just kind of that question and kind of, is there an answer
Sure.
to it for him?
Sure. Well, first I will say I think the question is a very interesting one for Yerby to be asking because he did not participate in any military service.
Right.
And so, and the fact that he was an expatriate also meant that he had left a lot of the real sort of thorny conversations that were happening about our military engagement around the world, right? And so, I think it's an interesting question for those reasons to begin with. But for him, I really think that military service represented the best of what men could be. And I use men there very particularly, right? That it was the place where a man could, in fact, become a man, could establish himself in a way that wasn't allowed in broader American society, at least not without there being some significant risk associated with that many times. And it was a place where men could kind of shape themselves against all of the social mores and norms and restrictions that Black men might have had, that military service allowed them to create themselves. And I think that that is sort of my takeaway from reading much of his work, and especially the short stories in the collection that deal with military service. All of those characters are characters who are trying to sort of stand and be men in very traditional kinds of senses, not in our more contemporary 21st century way of thinking about gender. But
Yeah.
for him, it really was, can you provide for your family? Can you defend your family? Are you willing to stand up when the odds are against you and go for the thing that you're being told you shouldn't even want? And can you do that knowing that the odds are stacked against you and still you pursue that dream? And so those are the kinds of things that I think he really valued and really, I think, celebrated in his characters. These are not characters who are downtrodden or sort of beaten and ground down. These are characters who managed to be heroic in the face of tremendous odds.
Which the whole time you're talking, I'm thinking Harry Forbes and Speak Now.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
because
Who
because
comes back
everything,
a wounded veteran, right?
do what?
Yeah, he comes back as a wounded veteran. And
Right. So
so, here he is trying to
he
figure
has
out
that
how
issue.
to be a man.
Exactly, but he stands and he's dignified.
Hmm.
He's the one who enacts the plan to help Kathy through her situation, her pregnancy.
That's right.
He's the one who's doing all these things. So he's fighting for himself, really, and you see that throughout too. But and of course, he's a Vietnam vet. He marries a Vietnamese woman, and he's treated negatively when he goes back to Georgia. That's why they moved to France. And then she dies in France. But all those things you're talking about are encapsulated in him. And then I'm even thinking about the Dahomian. I mean, that deals with war.
Yeah.
too, in various aspects. Um, I'm thinking actually most of his novels that I've read deal with war or conflict, military conflict. Goat Song's dealing with it with Sparta.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to think about that within the whole course of his work. Even Fox's, of
Right.
course, with the Civil War,
Right.
we do see some military service in there, isn't it? With Odelay? No, not with Odelay.
Well, we see the
Perhaps
character
Stephen's
Jen.
daughter.
Yes, that's right. She is sort of a spy, right? Going
Yeah,
back and forth and bringing medical supplies.
and
And
there's
then
that
you have the
whole
character Inch at the end.
yeah, but we don't see him in military service though. I don't think. But yeah, he serves. There's one scene. God, it's been a while since I've read it, but there's one scene at the very end that's very graphic, with what's happening, and I don't remember. I think it's actually with Etienne getting shot or something. I don't
Right,
remember,
because
but it's a
when
really graphic scene.
Stephen is arrested, right, and Etienne has been, I think, wounded. I think you're right. Or
Yeah,
is it Stephen who's wounded? Etienne has been arrested. One of those two,
I
right?
don't
And so
remember.
both of them end up in the military prison, and that's when Inch comes back, and and so we see him, and at that point he's sort of at the head of the military
Right.
unit that's there in town, and he brings them out of the prison and has this conversation with them. Of course, he had been enslaved by them, and so yeah, it's that moment of kind of the two opposing forces, and the white characters see Inch in a whole different way, right? Because he's this dignified, upstanding, accomplished military officer at that point, and here they are as prisoners. So it's
And I'm shaking my head because none of this is in the film.
well, there's only so much you can do in that film, right? Yeah.
They could have moved it past the panic of whatever year that was. They didn't even Inch doesn't even grow up. I mean, that's
Yeah.
that's an issue, and Etienne dies. I
Yeah.
mean, that's a big issue that undercuts what Yerby's doing in that book.
Hmm. Hmm.
But if you even want to get into this discussion, that novel comes out after the war, and of course, I think it's John Charles talks about that novel as a response to kind of the war, manhood in the war. And then if you look at the way it's changed in the film, it kind of sets
Hmm.
everything back in order for the home front. I mean,
Yeah, it
with
absolutely
Stephen
does.
and Odelay.
Yeah, I mean, I think the film is part of the lost cause tradition, right?
It is.
And so it shouldn't surprise us that that narrative ends before the Black Revolution has happened. So,
But the issue with the film was that there were goals to make it more kind of aligned with the book, but things seem to have fallen apart,
yeah, yeah,
which is interesting too. But we can talk about that later. But
yeah.
but 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 thinking about that, even thinking about the war of what exactly are you fighting for, the re-entrenchment of patriarchy and the male-centered household after the war plays out in there,
Mm-hmm.
even though
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't really play out in the book
Yeah,
because
yeah.
his daughter goes against him. The other women go against him too. He has the whole relationship with Desiree. So
Right.
there's all these other things that don't necessarily re-entrench that, but the film definitely does.
That's right. That's right. And the short stories are a kind of interesting mix of things, right? Because you see those things kind of playing out in all kinds of ways. So sometimes, so at the end of Salute to the Flag, as you've already discussed, you have the Black man who would stand up and thumb his nose at the flag rather than, lay there and get some medical attention and, sort of go back to life as it was, right? And
Right.
so you see a particular kind of ending there. I'm also thinking of stories like White Magnolias, where you have the Black woman and the white woman who are having tea together. And as the white woman sort of begins this reminiscence of, oh, it must have been glorious when we had slaves, and can't you just see it? And the Black woman, I can just imagine she's sitting there like, are you serious right now? And so you have that moment where she just, the Black woman, Hannah, just gets up and leaves.
Yeah.
And she's like, it's been nice. It's been real. So I'm out. Thank
And
you.
this is right after Beth's mom's like, you should come and work as a maid for us instead of going to grad
Exactly.
school.
Exactly.
But
Right. And so,
but what I
when
love,
she exits, that's a wonderful moment because she's walking down and here we have, I forget the main character's name, but she's running after
Beth,
her and Beth, that's right. And she plucks that magnolia, tears it up in front of her. Like, this is the moment where I'm letting go of all of this. I renounce that history and that legacy of mine. And I'm going to choose to be the kind of white woman who can befriend a Black woman in an authentic way. So,
and see,
there are gestures like
that's
that.
why I like that story. I like that moment at the end. She has those images of the bells and the balls and all this stuff. And I
Yes.
don't remember if she looks at Hannah or what. I don't remember exactly what triggers it, but she switches. So like in the very
Yeah.
next paragraph, she sees the slave coffles. She
Yeah.
sees enslaved individuals. She sees all this. She sees the other side.
Right.
And I think that's a powerful thing. And the reason I like that story, that was the first story I read, and that was published in Phylon,
Mm-hmm.
of course, too. I think in 44.
Yeah, I think it was.
Um, but the reason I like that story, too, is because it shows his early disentangling and deconstruction of those myths, especially
Mm-hmm.
white Southern womanhood,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is very important. And you do not, like I said, did not get that in the film, but you do get that in the book.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but that reminds me, too, we didn't even mention, which we should have, the story that made him famous.
Oh, yeah. And I don't have it in the collection because I can't get it.
Because
Otherwise,
it's with Harper's.
Hellfire would have been there. Yeah. Yeah.
And we just
Hellfire
found
is
out,
a
too, there
wonderful
may be,
story.
if anybody knows about this, there may be a film version or audio recording of that HBO did in the
Yeah.
early 1990s. If you have a clue, please let us know, because never heard anything about it, never seen it. But of course, he won the O. Henry Award for Health Card.
Mm-hmm.
And he was only the second Black writer to do it. Richard Wright won, I think, in 1939, and again another year.
Yes.
But health card's an important story. That's definitely within the vein of social protest, and definitely dealing with war and the military too, as you talk about in your piece.
That's right. Yeah, a health card, and I really wish it could have been part of the collection, but it's all over the place, so
Yeah.
people won't have trouble finding that one. But health card, I think, really uh, set him up in terms of that story. To me, feels like it is very close to the place that he comes from in terms of his Augusta roots and what he would have known as part of that community and as a young Black man growing up in the South, right? So it feels very, I don't know, it feels like tactile to me. Like I can see those characters, I can hear those characters, I hear the cadences. And what is happening in that story is as the young Black soldier has won, sort of gotten awarded leave so that he can spend some time with his new wife. And they are accosted by military police on their way to the house that they're going to be staying at. And these are military police that he's already seen kind of attacking Black soldiers. And so he knows the danger. He tries to get his wife out of there. And unfortunately, they have this encounter. And he's left devastated, right? Because he is not able to stand and defend her in the ways that he had wanted to do and really felt like he should do as a man. And so even though he is alive, he's broken, he's crying in her arms. And you can just sort of sense this tension that's going to be between them because she was the one who really prevented him from responding in a way that he felt was appropriate as a man to the insult that was leveled at her by those MPs. And so, it's just this really fraught, tangled mess, if you will, because you feel for him. You understand why he thinks it's important for him to stand and protect his wife. And you also understand why she would want to prevent that because she
Right.
knows, she feels that that would be a mortal danger for him and she wants him alive, right? And yet, those two very real impulses are in conflict with one another in that moment because you got to wonder at the end of that, like, what kind of man is he going to be? What's going to happen to their relationship as a result of this thing that has happened? Completely an external force, but now they have to find a way to navigate it. and they're a new couple, right? And so
Right.
it's a very painful story when you think about all that Yerby is trying to kind of expose there, the impact of racism on the Black family, on Black marriage. The sense of how do they move forward after something like this has happened? How do you move forward when you've seen your significant other humiliated, or when you've seen him beaten or drawn low, right? So how do you recover with him, and how do you help to build him back up in ways that allow him to go on? So I think those are all, especially for the time period, the 1940s, those were all very real questions for Black Americans in this country,
Yeah.
because the racism and the violence was so pervasive, right? And so all of that is something, those are moments where he's really trying to figure it out, and at least trying to give voice to something that people were experiencing that perhaps they didn't really know as, intellectually, or, maybe they knew it emotionally and psychologically, but didn't have words for it. And in that story, he gives them that moment where you have that. So where do we go from here?
Yeah.
Yeah,
And that's the story, of course, that led to Foxes.
that's right.
Even though he wrote a social protest novel, they saw promise in it, and he redid it to Foxes. And
Yeah.
he said at one point too, didn't he? Like, Foxes, I just wrote for money.
Yes.
It was
Yes.
I just tried to write the worst piece of trash I could write, or something
That's
like
right.
that.
Yes.
But look at how it turned out.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there's issues with it, but I think Health Car is an important story, and of course, it is. It's reprinted. I mean, Langston Hughes reprinted it in the best Black short stories of whatever time period he had. It's been reprinted elsewhere in anthologies. It's not in the Norton. It's not in recent anthologies, but it's been reprinted, and
That's
it's
right.
important for those reasons too. And of course, like you're talking about too, I started thinking about other novels that period, about Chester Himes, As If He Hollers, Let Him Go. Lillian Smith, of course, white writer who uses kind of World War I as a setting for Part of Strange Fruit. Kind of these moments during the war and these settings of the military, which is interesting. Of course, Jennifer James talks about this with African American literature, but
Yeah.
whole other thing. So there's a lot more we could talk about, of course, but time is running short, and I thank you for joining me. Make sure that you go out and order the short stories of Frank Yerby, because you need to read them, especially if you've read Yerby before. If you haven't, great introduction to Yerby and what he was doing, I would say, throughout his career. We don't have dates for all the stories, but definitely highlights what he was doing throughout his career. One of the pieces you have in there, I think I mentioned, is Pride's Castle, which is definitely an early treatment of the novel that turned into Pride's Castle. I mean, kind of that same narrative that's in there. So you see a little bit of these types of what he's doing.
Yeah.
So thank you, Dr. Watson.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it and enjoyed the chat.
I did too. And I hope you have a good day.
Thanks.